So welcome and thank you for joining us for Research in North American History today. It's great to have you here. We have a great lineup of speakers today that will guide you through some of the fascinating collections and resources that we have at Senate House Library and the Institute of Historical Research. After the presentations, there'll be time for you to ask questions via the chat in Zoom, and I'll read some of those questions out to the speakers. Following the event, we will email you with the presentations, linked to resources and the contact details of the speakers that you can see outlined here on the screen. And we will also be recording this event on our will be available on our YouTube channel 24 hours after the event. So to start the event, we have a very special guest to introduce the topic, and I'm really pleased that we have Dr. Sarah Dunstan, Fellow at the School of History, Queen Mary University of London, who I'll now hand over to you. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. I'm very excited to be here to talk to everyone today. Okay, so I'm going to talk today a little bit about my book, which is called Race, Rights and Reform, Black Activism in the French Empire and the United States from World War I to Cold War. As the title indicates, the book looks at African-American and Francophone Black collaborations in their struggle to access citizenship rights and human rights during this period. It involves people from throughout the French Empire, so various African states like Senegal, Algeria, but also from the Caribbean and obviously the United States. So the book itself connects archival material from the United Nations, from the Comintern, from the National Archives of France, from the National Archives of the United States, as well as the personal archives of key figures like the African-American scholar activist W.E.B. Du Bois, the poet Langston Hughes, and so on and so forth. Now, the argument that the book makes is that over this roughly 40-year period, these different groups from different parts of the world collaborated to try and reform the two republics of France and the United States in such a way that their race or their cultural background did not define or determine the kind of rights that they could access. So they were actively combating racism and discrimination and fighting against some of the political and cultural strictures of colonization. Now, this is what the book does now, but that's not really how it started. And I want to talk you through some of the sources and materials that got me to make this argument and that made me think that there was a compelling story to tell about these collaborations across these groups. So it started more or less with a street sign, this street sign, which is Allez aimer Césaire, and it's in La Rochelle in France. Now, I happened to be in La Rochelle during my undergraduate degree on exchange. I was studying French literature. And La Rochelle used to be a port in the slave trade, and so it has lots of commemorations and memorial sites that engage with this history, this legacy of French Empire and slavery. And I was really interested in this street sign. Sounds a bit weird, but I was studying French literature, so it said the word poet, and I wanted to find out more. So when I looked up Aimé Césaire, it turns out that not only is he a poet, but he becomes a really key politician and figure in French political and cultural thought and history. And you may be familiar with him as one of the founding figures of a very important cultural political movement called Négritude. Now, I started reading some of Aimé Césaire's essays and poems, and it became very quickly apparent that for him, key African-American Harlem Renaissance poets and artists and thinkers have been a huge, huge influence, right? He makes reference to people like Claude Mackay, who was a Jamaican novelist who spent a lot of time in America as well as in France. He talks about Langston Hughes, he references W.E.B. Du Bois. These are key African-American figures. And I was really interested by this because I wasn't really aware of the connection between the African-American experience in the 20th century and this French history. And so I started reading around the topic, and it became very apparent that actually a large number of African American activists and thinkers and painters spent time in Paris, both in the interwar period and in the post-war period. The most well-known of these stories involve lots of jazz musicians and artists, dancers like Josephine Baker. You might be familiar with her. And they had a huge, vibrant presence. But a little less known is this continuing history throughout the period that I look at in my book of activism and efforts to collaborate over the key political rights. So I went about trying to find out more about this story, and I did so through a variety of different sources. Now, the first of which, and perhaps an obvious place is to start, is in a number of conferences that were organized by African American and French African thinkers, the first of which, for my purposes, is one held in 1919, and it's a Pan-African Congress that was held in Paris at the same time as the Paris Peace Treaties were being coordinated by the United States, by France, by England in the aftermath of World War I. Now, at this 1919 Pan-African Congress, lots of people from throughout the African diasporic world met because they wanted to have a say in what was going to happen to the African colonies that had belonged to Germany prior to the war. And so this is a really interesting resource to think about, the ideas that these people had about the relationship between colonies and their predicament in mainland United States and France. It was an interesting insight into the ways that race was elaborated very differently in the United States and in France and the extended French Empire. And so this photo was a good starting point as any. Very fortunately, it has a list down the bottom of the people that are featured in it. That's not always the case. And that can be very frustrating when you have these tantalizing, amazing photographs of everyone who attended a Congress, but you've got no idea who these people are. And you kind of have to painstakingly see if you can match up faces to other people. The other resource that was really useful here is that sometimes when you go through personal papers of these individuals, they have drafts or transcripts of the speeches that they gave at the Congress. So whilst you never really get a sort of eyewitness understanding of what goes on, you can get a sense of the arguments that were brought up sometimes, and this is more the case in later conferences, like there was one in 1956 in Paris, and they went so far as to actually have secretaries typing transcripts of the debates as they occurred. You can imagine my joy in discovering that. It's quite unusual, I think. But this also leads me to another kind of source that was really useful, and this is the Black press. So there's a long history in America of a separate Black press where African American communities sort of agitate for their rights or publish opinions about their community in a that's sort of separate from say, for example, the New York Times, so that where they're not given opportunity to voice their opinions and affairs in white newspapers, they started their own press. And this is an incredibly rich source to access the different variety, the huge spectrum of opinions and perspectives that are coming out of the African American community, both in the 20th century, which I look at, but this goes back way into the 19th century as well. And I've given the example that's up on the screen at the moment is The Crisis, which was the official organ journal of the National Association of Colored People, which is an incredibly important activist organization for agitating for the rights of African Americans in the United States. And this journal provided a platform for people like W.B. Du Bois to talk about, for example, the Pan-African Congress of 1919. It was also a journal in which many Francophone African politicians or intellectuals published. There were, of course, French journals as well, where African American thinkers and writers published their work. So there's this kind of fascinating print conversation going on, and that was incredibly useful for me. You can also, and I will send through the link for this will be circulated, but for example, W.B. Du Bois has his own personal collection of letters and papers really that is digitized and available online. And this is an example of one of the many letters that he sent to a Senegalese politician, Blaise Diagne, who's based in Paris, as they organized certain kind of activist movements and talked about the Pan-African organization that they'd established in 1919. But the thing about one of the things that I really struggled with is that many of the actors and movements that I look at were incredibly subversive, and they were agitating for rights in a way that really unsettled and disconcerted the status quo. So, for example, the American government and the French government at various times have invested in preventing these voices from being heard and in curtailing some of these activist movements. So one of the issues that I had to wrestle with in fleshing out the story that I was trying to write is that I may know someone's name, I may know that they were key in organizing lots of meetings, lots of movements, marches, protests, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they've left behind a personal archive or that they've in fact written down their ideas. So sometimes the only access that I have to, or that I was able to have to thinking about people's ideas during this time was through what Foucault calls police text. Now, what that means is, in my case, that these people were considered subversive by the state. And so organizations in America, for example, like the FBI, were invested in following their every move. So you can, from the documents that were collated by FBI agents, you can get a sense of what these people's opinions are. So you often have an FBI agent who's infiltrated a movement, writing down their eyewitness insights of the speech that someone made. A perfect example of this in the French case is Lamine Senghor, who's a Senegalese labor union activist who was really key in engaging with North American sort of communist and labor union organizations in this period. He didn't leave any personal papers behind, but we know quite a lot about him because at any one time, the French equivalent of the FBI was sort of tailing him, writing down his speeches, wondering and inquiring about his finances. And so actually we know quite a bit about him, but from the perspective of those who are trying to thwart his efforts. I wanted to show you a resource from the FBI archives that was incredibly useful for my purposes. So this is a website called FBI's, and essentially it's a collection of FBI files on African-American authors and literary institutions that have now been obtained through the US Freedom of Information Act. They're available on the internet, and they're incredibly useful for getting a perspective of how the US state was thinking about some of these key African-American intellectuals in this period. I've got an example here. This is from a file on James Baldwin. Now, James Baldwin is or was an African-American writer and activist who spent a lot of time in France and was considered subversive, a threat to the US state because of his commentary on the discrimination faced by African-American peoples. And this is an example of the kind of material that you might work with if you look at FBI archives. So you can see that the black crossing out, right? This has been censored when it's been released to historians. But it's an incredibly useful insight, both into perhaps what information might be considered sensitive, but also into the kind of behaviors that Baldwin was engaged with that the US state thought, they should be monitoring. And Baldwin's a particularly useful example because he himself wrote many essays, novels, and so we can get a sense of his perspective and put it side by side with the perspective that we get from this FBI material. So that brings me to the end of my my talk. That I wanted to give you an insight into the kind of sources that I can use, and also suggest that just because there isn't necessarily an immediately obvious answer to the questions that you want to ask about your topic, doesn't mean that you can't find the answer from the material that is available. It's just sometimes you might have to think laterally. And your biggest aid in thinking laterally are archivists and librarians, who are very, very useful and they're so familiar with the material that they have, and they can offer incredible insights. And so on that note, I will pass over to Simon Baker, who will start providing you with some amazing information.
Hi, thanks Sarah for that. That's really interesting insight into the research process. As Sarah said, my name is Simon Baker, and I'm one of the editors of BBIH, the Bibliography of British and Irish History. BBIH deals with secondary sources and should be one of your starting points for a literature search or a literature review. Argler and Mike will outline other online resources in their talks. So, this is BBIH, Bibliography of British and Irish History. It is a database of over 625,000 references to British and Irish history and imperial history, including the American colonies, as well as relations with other countries from 55 BCE to the present day. A curated listing of what has been written on British, Irish, and imperial history since 1909. For those doing Irish history and relations with North America, I highly recommend Irish History Online. This resource is a really useful source for the Irish diaspora in the Americas, as shown in this screenshot of over 2,600 references on that topic. So we have Boston, Worcester, New Brunswick, all the way down to Minnesota, and just that one screen. As an example of the global reach of BBIH, this map shows the coverage excluding the British Isles. As you can see, most references are actually for the United States, which includes the American colonies. Note the natural focus on ex-colonies, for example, Canada or Australia, but also on France and Germany. In this session, I'll naturally focus on North America and the Caribbean. As I've said, BBIH covers British and imperial history, but also relations with other countries, as shown for a search on Haiti, which covers, as you can see, diplomatic relations, the Haitian Revolution, and the work of the Trinidadian historian and intellectual C.L.R. James on that revolution. For those interested in how BBIH is compiled, and I'm sure there are lots of you out there, there is a link to a video featuring lots of mad cats. As with any other resource, printed or online, it's important to know where the data comes from and how it is compiled. I've also included a link to a history of BBIH. So, BBIH includes books, articles from journals, and chapters from books of essays, including Festschriften and conference proceedings. So this is an example of the book, Children of Uncertain Fortune. The bibliographical information is at the top of the screen and subject information in the middle of the screen. And to the bottom are listed reviews with links to online access, which can help in a historiographical analysis of that book. Anything in green is a link to a new search or online resource. So you can click on author or subject or place. Here highlighted with blue arrows, I've done a search for the author Liv C. Daniel, which links to his other works, as you can see there. And I've also clicked on the place Jamaica, and you can see there are nearly 900 references to Jamaica. This is an example of an article. We cover over 800 journals, from Acadiensis, Journal of the History of the Atlantic Region, to the Journal of the Early Republic. And this is an article from that journal, Ancient Moderns and Africans. Again, bibliographical information is at the top of the screen, and links to online access at the bottom, including links to full text via the DOI, that's the Digital Object Identifier, and links to online access services such as JSTOR and Project Muse, as well as the journal homepage. For a more detailed look at using these links, see the BBIH video, How to Research Without Leaving Your Bedroom. This was designed for the COVID pandemic and the restrictions in place. And of course, here we have book articles, in this case, the collective volume, Women in the American Revolution, which lists the individually authored chapters, and clicking on Women's Politics, Anti-Slavery Politics takes you to that title. Notice the link to the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, highlighted in red here at the bottom. By clicking on this link, you're taken to the biography of the African-American poet Phyllis Whitley. And at the bottom of her entry is a reciprocal link to BBIH, but also the American National Biography online. So if you click on that, you're taken to that. It's often worthwhile exploring the links in online resources. They are often overlooked and can help you in your research. Other useful national biographies, and this is my particular favorite, is the Dictionary of Canadian Biography, which is free. There's also the Dictionary of Caribbean and Afro-Latin American Biography. So BBAH covers people as subjects, everything from Pocahontas, as in this case, through to Malcolm X and his influence on the Mau Mau Rebellion, his time at the Oxford Union, and his influence on British race relations in the 1960s. Searching BBIH, you can search on all the types of media I've described above, so article in a book, article in a journal or a book. But you can also search on the usual bibliographical topics, author, title, journal, year of publication, as well as subjects, place name, and person as subject, as in the case of Pocahontas above. And they're very useful, especially for historians, which is tucked down the very bottom as the period covered search. There's a short video guide to searching, which will hopefully help you. I'll end with a search on cultural relations in North America and the Caribbean from 1800. So as you can see, it's a fairly simple, straightforward search, which gives just over 900 references. And as you can see, there's everything from sports scholarships from Ireland through to literary connections and the influence of reggae music and film. You can keep up to date with BBAH by checking the On History IHR blog. We're also very aware of the challenges facing university students and teachers at this present time, and therefore have developed a help pack which helps you get the most from the bibliography of British and Irish history. There are videos on searching, how to export data and create bibliographies, setting up email alerts, and connecting to external content, etc. Thank you and good luck in your researches. I'll pass you to Jonathan, who will discuss primary source material in British History Online. Thanks, Jonathan, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. Hi, everybody. I'll just share my screen now. I'm Jonathan Blaney, the editor of British History Online, which is a digital library of key sources for the history of the British Isles. I'll show you what I'm going to talk about today, very briefly. So I'll go through these. I'll start off with a little intro to BHO, if you haven't seen it before. It has a lot about the workings of the British state, but also from the point of view of this talk, lots about foreign colonial relations of the state. At the moment, I want to stress that almost all of the transcriptions on the site are completely free to everyone in the world, wherever you are. In normal times, in non-pandemic times, about 20% of the site is behind a paywall, but actually everything I'm going to show you today is always free all the time, so there's no rush to go and look at it. Key areas for us are early modern history, parliamentary history, British local history, and British maps. So the main thing I think you would use BHO for in terms of the Americas is around the colonial period, particularly the 17th century. From the 18th and especially the 19th century onwards, we don't have as much material. But if you do have an unusual name, a person or a place in your Americas research, it's always worth trying a search on BHO just in case. So our biggest collection for this material is the Calendars of State Papers Colonial. We have 41 volumes of these, about 1,000 pages per volume, so that's quite a lot of material. They cover the period 1574 to 1696, but there's a very heavy emphasis on the 17th century material within that. Now, these were mostly calendared a long time ago, over 100 years ago. So be aware when using them that the editing reflects the views and the priorities of the people, the editors who did the calendaring at the time. Let me show you an example. I'm going to go into this one for 1681 to 85. And let's pick one at random. So calendars are summaries of documents that are reordered from their archival ordering by sender perhaps, or by topic in the archive. So if you're interested in a particular month or year, and here I'm showing you, of course, July 1681, they're perfect. So in each one, you'll see a summary of the manuscript, the date, where it was sent from in the case of the one on the left, and then the square brackets at the end tells you the archival collection from which it came. So this colonial entry book, colonial papers and so on, these are all in the National Archives in Kew. Now, these summaries are not always as comprehensive as you would like, especially if it's on something that's of particular interest to you. Often there are things like lists of people in a ship mentioned, but they don't actually give you the list of names, which may be what you want. So if you want that, you'd have to go to the National Archives and ask to see that particular manuscript, and be aware that if it's in, say, 17th century handwriting, it might be a bit tough to read. You might need a while to get your eye in. But in fact, this is what the calendars were designed for. They are a finding aid to archival sources. So if you go to the National Archives and show them this entry in BHO, or give them the reference, that should be exactly what they need to get you the document you need. Just be aware that things like colonial entry book, those are old cataloguing terms that have been updated now with what they call modern document references. But don't worry, because in the National Archives, they have these great mapping documents which tell you where that is now in the new archival ordering at the TNA. So let me go to our next source. Oops. This is another calendar, the Journal of the Board of Trade and Plantations. This body actually still exists, although it's now more commonly called just the Board of Trade. And at this period, meetings seemed to consist of letters being read out to the board, and then they were discussed by whoever was on the board that day. So here's an example. So they're much more specific, and you can see, because it's a calendar, they're all just gathered up. New York, Jamaica, lots of anywhere that's of interest to the board would be discussed. And there's often trade stuff in here, as you can see from these headings. And again, you can go and look at the papers in the National Archives if you want to go deeper. So this is a calendar of one particular source, whereas the Calendar of State Papers Colonial, which I just showed you, is a grab bag of archival sources, which is often the case with our calendars. And that comes with that same caveat I mentioned earlier, that the sources included and thought to be important enough to be included in this calendar might not be the ones that we today would want to include in our if we calendared again. But this calendaring was a huge task that took place over a century, and so you can imagine it's not going to happen again anytime soon. But we do have some other specific calendars you might want to look through as well. One that comes to mind is that we have 3 sets of the Treasury books and papers covering about 200 years from 1550 to 1570. And again, those are always free on British History Online to read. And you can imagine with Treasury books, there's obviously lots of stuff to do with trade, to do with the Royal Navy and colonial expansion and that kind of thing. So have a look at those if that's your interest. And a final thing I want to mention is quite new on British History Online. We've added a listing of theses awarded in history in Britain and Ireland from 1901 to 2014. I'm just showing you the 1970 to 2014 set here. And they're organised by topic. So what I have on this page is all of the Americas, that's the whole continent of the Americas, and the West Indies. So everything you would want in terms of that topic will be on this page. I've done a quick count, and there are, I think, 1,389 theses. But of course, that does include things like Brazil and Chile and so on. If I go down, I'll show you what they look like. So you get the title, the author and the date and things like that. They're in chronological order. But one thing we have done, which is worth knowing, is that this used to be a database, and it had database terms which you could search. And we've exposed those as text terms now. The effect of that is that you can do searches. And I'll give you an example. I'm going to search for gender. And you can see this is coming up under categories. And if I go down, you'll get more gender terms. The importance of this is that the word gender does not appear in any of these titles. So slave women in British West Indian society, if you search for gender, you wouldn't find that, and it's difficult to know what you could search for. So it's really worth trying that. But again, as I was saying with the previous catalogue, this was done over a period of 40 odd years. So different editors at different times gave different terminology to the theses, and some years that wasn't even done. So you use that, but don't imagine that it's completely comprehensive or even consistent, but it is a useful guide. You may have noticed that there were links on some of these. This is something I added very recently, these green links. So these theses are all very well, but what if you want to read them? So I've added links through to the British Library's Ethos service, which is an e-theses service. It's the kind of the central hub to find out where a thesis is in the UK. Not everything links. That's partly because Ethos has a different scope to what we have. Ethos doesn't include non-doctoral theses like MAs and MPhils, but we do. And it doesn't include theses awarded in the Republic of Ireland, but we do. So those won't be there. And also I added these links through an automated process. So there had to be a fairly close match between the form of the title as it appears in our listing and the form of the title that appears on Ethos. And if there's too much of a variation, and often they do change, then it won't be matched. And I'm telling you that because if you see a thesis that fits the scope for Ethos, i.e. it's a PhD awarded in the UK, it's still worth going to Ethos and searching for it, because if you search around trying a few different things, particularly the name, if it's an unusual name, you might find it anyway. So don't assume that it's not on Ethos. But if it is, I'm going to click through to one here. This is a global policy in a regional setting on the Eisenhower administration and Latin America. And this is now the link. I've gone through to Ethos at the British Library, and you'll see immediately that it's a very helpful abstract of the thesis written by its author, which will tell you straight away whether it is definitely of interest to you, because the title alone might not be sufficient. And then a final thing you can often do, although it doesn't work in every case, but of course I checked for this one that it does before I put it down, is you can click through to the thesis itself. In this case, I'll click on this handle link and I'll get taken through to the repository of De Montfort University, where this thesis was awarded. Here it is again with the same abstract, but now I can open it straight away and then start reading that thesis within 2 clicks and about 5 seconds of finding it on British History Online. So we think that this is a really useful service for historians, and particularly in lockdown, it's a way you can carry on doing your research from home. So that's all from me. I'm going to now hand over to Argila, who is the history librarian at Senate House Library. Thanks.
Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen with you. There we go. For those of you who are not aware of Senate House Library yet, we are the central library of the University of London, and we specialize in the research collections for arts, humanity, and the arts, humanities, and social sciences. Students and staff of the University of London are entitled to use us free of charge, but we also offer memberships or UK and international students and academics, as well as for members of the public. So do check our website for a membership that might suit you. So one of our major collection strengths lies in North American history. And to start, I'll give you an overview over the variety of resources that you can access through us. And after that, I'll give you a very quick example of how to search the catalogue and our e-resources list to find the resources by yourselves. So let's start with our research collections. One of these research collections is the US Studies collection, which gives a broad coverage of the history, institutions, and culture of the United States. The collection's foundation lies in the former library of the United States Information Service, which was an information agency of the Foreign Service of the US government in the UK. After the library closed in 1966, the collection was moved to the Senate House. And at the time, the collection spanned more than 25,000 volumes, which represented the largest and most comprehensive collection of American literature in the UK. So since then, we've built upon this historically valuable collection with new acquisitions, and we continue to develop it actively as well. Another collection that is of relevance to North American history is the Institute of Commonwealth Studies Library, which is also housed in Senate House Library. And here you can locate materials on the histories of all nations in the Commonwealth, including Canada and the Caribbean. It includes a rich collection of printed materials, and in particular, difficult to find journals, pamphlets, and ephemera on the political and economic activities of the countries covered. And then our special collections and archives. These are our unique, rare, and historically significant collections that we hold in Senate House Library. And these are available upon request in our special collections reading room. For North American history, our foremost printed special collection is the Manton Marble Collection. This is a collection of around 1,000 pamphlets, 53 scrapbooks, and also press cuttings covering the period 1844 to 1911. The collection takes its name from the American journalist Manton Marble, and he's best known for being the editor of the New York World, and also for being appointed as a special envoy to the governments of Great Britain, France, and Germany to explore the possibility of adopting international bimetallism in 1885. Because of his rather special interest in this topic, the collection features tons of material on bimetallism and currency, but there's also a huge wealth of materials on American politics, foreign relations, and economic matters from the latter half of the 19th century that you can find here. We have some archives on US history as well, and they include materials on economic, trade, and commercial relationships between the US and Britain, some of which date back to the 18th century. And we also hold some archival materials on US politics and trade, and we have a full subject guide on these archives available on our website, which I've linked you on this slide, and will be in the resource list that we will send out as well. We also have several archives on Caribbean history. For example, we have CLR James's papers on Caribbean politics, and we also have several archives on colonial economics, trade, and finance spanning the 17th to 19th centuries. Among these are, for example, some financial administration papers on Barbados and the Leeward Islands from the 17th century. We have the papers of William Hewitt, who was the commissioner for the sale of crown lands in the Caribbean in the 18th century. And we also have 3 sets of family papers: the Newton family papers, the Akers family papers, and the Taylor family papers, all of which had investments in sugar plantations in the Caribbean and whose archives document their involvement in slavery. Now moving on to our e-resources, these also offer a huge amount of options for you to research into North American history. Here's just a very small selection of them for you to get an overview. So the resources include things like America, History and Life, which, similar to BBIH, indexes publications on the history and culture of the United States and Canada. There are biographical databases you can access, such as the African American Biographical Database. And there are many e-resources that contain primary source material, such as letters, diaries, photographs, government documents, and ephemera. And the topics of these are quite a broad span too. So as you can see on the list here, you can access things like the Colonial State Papers, which covers Britain's colonial relations with the Americas, as well as the Caribbean and the Atlantic world, or collections of primary sources on North American women, immigrants to North America, or Native Americans. So that's just a very brief overview of all the things that we can offer you in our collections. And what I'll do now is I'll share my screen with you so I can give you an example of how you can find these resources yourself. So you should now be seeing the Senate House Library homepage. And to visit our catalogue, you just have to go on the Visit the Catalogue button on the home page right here. So the catalogue is really the main tool that we provide for you to search across all our print and electronic research collections. So let's say, for example, that you're looking for works covering the connections between the Caribbean and the United States. To start with, you can use the search box here and just type in those two terms. And start your search from there. We already got a few hundred results that you can look through. From here, we have multiple options as well on the left-hand side to filter your results further. And this is really helpful just to make your query a bit more precise. So say, for example, you're currently at home, you can't really make use of any print materials at this stage. In this case, what you could do is go to the online filter under the heading Availability. And once that is loaded, now you'll be displayed only results for ebooks and other e-content that you can immediately access online with your Senate House Library membership. So I'm going to clear the filter so we can have a look at a few more of these. Takes a little bit to load, my apologies. There we go. So another useful filter that you can use is you can filter by different formats under the category format. So you could, for example, search for books or journals, or you could also decide to investigate some more unusual publication formats that fall outside the usual forms of academic publication. For example, you could decide to look at the category for pamphlets, and this will give you access to some more ephemeral or potentially rare material to read that you wouldn't necessarily find elsewhere. Our collections at Senate House are particularly strong on these collections of pamphlets, so this category is always worth investigating if it comes up. There's usually a lot of interesting, fun stuff to find there. And I'll clear the filter again to show you another one which can be really useful. So if we scroll a little bit further down along the left-hand side, you'll also see that you can filter by different collections, and in particular, you can filter by archives and manuscript collections. So choosing this category will only return entries for your search in the archives and manuscripts collections that we hold. And as you can see here, that will give you an overview of some of the unique sources we have, such as personal papers or some organizational papers that you can see here. And further down here, you will also see the CLR James papers that I mentioned a while ago. So these types of searches will return a mixture of printed and electronic material to you. The only disadvantage of this type of search is that you can't search within journals or e-resources for individual articles within them. However, there is also a way to do that and search across indexed electronic content. So at the top of the catalogue here, you might notice that there are two different tabs here. One is the catalogue tab, which we're currently in, and then there's also this tab for electronic resources. If you switch to this electronic resources tab, you will be able to perform a search across all the indexed ebooks, e-journals, and e-resources that the library subscribes to. And you'll see that now you have access to hundreds of thousands of more results, literally. And again, this is quite an overwhelming amount of results, of course. So again, the filters on the left-hand side are your friend here to narrow down the focus of your search. Just note that they're slightly different from the ones in the catalogue tab. So if you wanted to, for example, look for those individual e-journal entries, you could select under the format heading academic journals, and that will already narrow down your search by almost half of the results. Because there's quite a lot of content, as you can see, it takes a lot of time, but here we go, got already less than half the results we had originally. However, what you probably notice is that some of the results are still not really relevant to history. They're also from a lot of other disciplines. So what you can also do in this case is go to the subject heading and select the category history. So you cut out any other publications from other disciplines as a result. And once you've done that, we've now narrowed it down to just a few thousand from there. If you wanted to drill down a bit further than this, you can apply more filters that are available alongside. They're just taking a little bit to load, my apologies. There we go. So for example, you could filter by different languages. You could decide that you only want entries from a particular journal. So you could say, I only want things from the American Historical Review, or you could decide you want the more recent publications. So you just filter by publication year. So as you can see, this kind of search can be a great tool to explore a hugely wide range of electronic content for your research. The final thing I just want to quickly show you is how to see our list of all our e-resources. And you can do this by going to the top menu here above the two tabs and by clicking on Database A to Z on the right-hand side of this menu. So to find databases on North American history, you can probably best make use of this search box here on the right-hand side to do that. Unlike the electronic resources tab that I just showed you, though, search only searches across the titles and the descriptions of the e-resources rather than within the individual resources. So just be aware of that. So if we would try to replicate our search, we just did in the catalog, we wouldn't unfortunately find anything. So you just have to think of alternative terms to perform your search. You could, for example, choose the term North American or America or similar variations on that. And actually typing in America or American can make a slight difference. So just try around with different terms. So if we just type in America, we get a list of 22 different databases that we can have a look into. And to filter down your results further from here, one thing you can also do is use the drop-down menus at the top of the list. If you, for example, only wanted primary sources, you could go to the all database types, drop-down list, and select primary sources from here. And then you have about 11 resources, which you can go through and explore further if those are relevant to you. So as you can see, there are tons of ways in which you can explore the resources the library offers. And it's worth investigating different tools that can help you provide further materials for your research. I hope this has given you some inspiration to explore the resources for yourself. But if you do have any questions or need any help with any of this, I'm very happy to be contacted at any time. And just a final note, some of our library servers are slightly changed and altered due to the COVID-19 pandemic. So do have a look at our website for updates on that. But in the meantime, I will hand over to Mike, who will introduce you to the resources at the IHR library.
All right, thank you, Argula. Right, I'll just share my screen. Right, okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Townsend, the Collections and Metadata Librarian here at the IHR. And now I'll just talk to you briefly about the library's North American collections and specifically some aspects of our holdings on Native American First Nations histories, ways in which you can search for relevant material in this subject, and finally explain in a couple of ways you can still access our collections during lockdown. Overall, the IHR has 4 main North American collections. 3 are part of our large colonial history collection, which include the colonial territories that would become the United States, then Canada and the Caribbean, and a collection on the United States history, which is split into a general sub-collection and one devoted to histories of individual states. The colonial American collection mainly consists of published primary sources on the 13 British colonies, with particular strengths including extensive runs of local historical society publications, such as from the Colonial Society of Massachusetts and the Connecticut Historical Society, published government sources such as the calendars of state papers of colonial, already mentioned, and the state papers of Virginia and New Hampshire, as well as sources on the history of religion and enslavement during the colonial period. Although not as extensive, there is also a growing section on the history of New France, covering all the territory from Canada and the Great Lakes down the Mississippi to Louisiana. For more information on our collections, here on the slide, you can see also a link to our collection guides. And don't worry about scribbling down the URL. The link will be to the IHR collection page will be included in the bibliography that we'll send out at the end of the session. Our Canadian collection also includes works on the area of New France that would become Canada, as well as its history after the 7 Years' War, being particularly strong for the 19th century. Here you can find extensive runs of relevant general history of Canada, such as the Champlain Society publications, as well as sub-collections on Canadian provinces and territories, with comparative large collections of published primary sources on Quebec, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. Although our holdings on the Caribbean are currently quite small compared to other collections discussed today, it is growing rapidly. Also, large collections on the Caribbean can be found within the Institute of Commonwealth Studies collections currently housed within Senate House Library. Our collections currently comprise of, again, published primary sources on colonial Cuba, Jamaica, and Barbados, the history of the Dominican Republic, and Haiti during the Wars of Liberation in the early 19th century, although works on other states are also collected. The Library's United States collection comprises mainly of, again, published primary sources on the history of the Republic since the War of Independence. It has extensive holdings on political history with runs of correspondence and papers of presidents and other politicians, freely available, available to browse on the open shelves. The library also has a run of the congressional debates up to the 1920s, which can be fetched from our closed stacks. Another particular strength of the general US collection is its holdings on the Civil War. Not only can relevant works on the historiography and historical memory of the Civil War be found within our collections, the library has approximately 400 separate titles, including a run of the official Union history of the Civil War, published political and military papers and correspondences, as well as a rapidly growing collection of published diaries of Union and Confederacy soldiers, as well as non-combatants. The library also has a collection of published works on the individual US states as well. Most of the collection is in our closed stacks at the moment, but we do a number of fetches throughout the day, and a section of the US states collection is also on the open shelves in the North American Reading Room, including works on 19th and 20th century New York State, Chicago, and Texas. There are a number of other IHR collections where relevant material can be found. Primary sources on California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, and Florida during the periods of Spanish and Mexican rule can be found in our Mexican history collection, while works on Canadian and US foreign policy and the sources on their military histories can be found in our international relations and military history collections, respectively. Right, moving on now to the next part of the presentation. Since taking over the management of the library's North American collections a few months ago, I've been aware of the range of material housed within them about the histories of Native American First Nation communities in Canada, the US, and the Caribbean. As an additional note, this too continues further south. Works on indigenous communities in Mexico, Central America, and South America can be found in the library's Latin American collections. Obviously, I'm quite glad of the range of material already present in the collections, but I'm aware that there are some areas the IHR could acquire more works on, such as the history of indigenous communities in the 20th and 21st centuries, which we currently have less material on compared to the colonial periods in the 19th century. Another area I hope to address regarding the collections is to endeavour to make our works on Native American First Nations histories more visible to researchers. Other libraries that have wished to do the same have re-evaluated their classification schemes which they use. Although it may not necessarily be noticed by some, the way that titles are arranged can have repercussions on how easily they can be retrieved and ultimately used by researchers. As stated by the information scientist, Professor Hope Olson, classification schemes can harbour sometimes implicit or even explicit biases on who created them. Schemes such as Dewey and Library of Congress have been examined and correctly and rightfully continue to be reviewed. And this is something that we will be doing in the in-house schemes in the IHR. To ensure various aspects of Native American First Nation history are given greater prominence within the classification schemes and hopefully improve the ease with which readers can find them, more specific notation has been given to works on this subject. Echoing the work I've done on the Latin American history classification scheme, there are now specific points in the scheme and thus specific points on the shelves where similar titles can be grouped. For example, at specific points in the colonial and Canadian schemes, notation has been given over to general Native American histories, while in the main US scheme, there is also a notation on Native American civil rights movements of the 20th and 21st century. Of course, work still needs to be done on these schemes and will be always ongoing. Titles on Native American First Nations histories are incredibly diverse, as you can imagine. I would not want to risk funneling these works into only a handful of spots on the shelves. For example, would works by Native American politicians or religious leaders be more useful all in one spot or sitting alongside other works on politics and religion for its given period? That's probably something that needs to be judged on a title by title basis. And of course, dialogue with readers is always welcome. Classification schemes are, however, not the only means by which researchers find material, as we've seen today. Indeed, the first port of call with will be a search of some kind, either in an online resource, library or archive catalogue, or printed index. As we all know, as we explore a subject, we become familiar with the leading authors and sources of our respective field of research. However, starting to explore a new subject often means, in my case at least, using what I hope are relevant key terms and seeing what results I get. Although I would certainly use terms like Native American, First Nation, or Indigenous, it may also be recommended to use terms which don't tend to be used as much anymore, or which are now normally avoided in current writing. For example, in the online resource Gist Historical Texts, which includes the content of early English books online, 18th century collections online, and 19th century books from the British Library, I conducted a general research with the term American Indian, which produced 14,767 hits. A similar search I did using the term Eskimo produced 1,182. Similar results can be found in other formats. Looking through the index of the correspondence of Andrew Jackson, published between 1926 and 1935, there are over 50 entries for Indian, with sub-index headings including removing squatters, 8 entries, while under Cherokee, sub-index headings include exchange of land and general migration, 11 entries. Although it's interesting to know, Trail of Tears does not appear as a term in this index. Therefore, even though we may not use some of the terms described now in our work, it's important to be aware of them and unfortunately, maybe even employ them in search strategies from time to time. Having talked about linguistic persistence, obviously terms are fluid and new ones come to the fore. And this is an aspect I've been examining of the records used in the IHR catalogue. Although features like book titles must be recorded exactly how it appears in the final catalogue record, it is often up to the librarian which subject headings are applied. Looking at conventions in other libraries and archives, and following what have been implemented in, say, for example, Manitoba archives, I've now tend to use terms like Indigenous peoples rather than Indians of North America, North, Central, or South America. Of course, there is a balance to be struck between old and new language. At present, terms like Aztec, Iroquois, and Navajo are still not only used in library catalogues, but in general discourse. There's not to say, though, that at some point, the respective terms Mexica, Haudenosaunee, and Diné will become more common, everyday terms used. Therefore, to summarize, when searching for material, it's important to be aware of both linguistic ghosts, as I call them, that may still yield results in your search strategies, and new emerging terms that may gain greater currency. Additionally, reviewed classification schemes will hopefully bring similar material together to aid serendipitous searches on the shelves, something that's hopefully not too far away as lockdown is eased. Right, and to finish off, here are some details you may wish to know, although the links are provided in the resource list that we will send at the end of the session. Listed here are details about how you can join the IHR library, and once you have joined, ways in which you can, during lockdown, you can visit the library, or if that's not possible, you can take advantage of our free inquiry and scanning service, as well as the URL to our catalogue. And lastly, here is a link to our portal of free resources, which we've been compiling for the last year. There you can find over 800 resources listed, including links to digital projects and online resources on US, Caribbean, and Canadian history. Right, so I'll just stop sharing now. Okay, I hope you found not only this brief talk useful, but all the presentations from the speakers today. Now, in the final part of today's session, we will answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to all our speakers. As I mentioned at the start, please do ask your questions in the chat, and I will read them out to our fabulous speakers that have done a great job of getting through all the many amazing resources we have between us in the hour. And I think we just have spent 10 minutes just to ask it with a few questions. And of course, you can always follow up with the librarians and speakers you see here with anything else following the event. We have one question at the moment from Claire Street. She's asked, is it possible to access MA dissertations via the British History Online website? And if so, how is it possible to access dissertations or theses that are not clickable? Many thanks for the useful information.
Good question. It's not possible from BHO, but the information on the site should help you to access the dissertation. So every listing, whatever, that's a PhD or an MA or MPhil, will have the institution that awarded it. And therefore, that institution's library should have a copy of the MA dissertation or whatever you're interested in. It will vary. The older ones will probably be in print form only, I would guess. So you may have to go to the actual library, unfortunately, which might not be easy, especially at the moment. But more recent MA dissertations would have been submitted in electronic form, and so you may be able to get a copy straight away electronically. So the first thing I would do is contact the library of the institution that's listed as awarding the dissertation.
Thank you, Jonathan. I hope that's answered your question, Claire. Just another one. Yes, she says, thanks so much, that's great. Do encourage other people to get in touch with any questions. While we're waiting for any more questions, just wondered if anyone wanted to share any particular favourites of theirs from the collections. I know there's so many items, yeah, but it's good to highlight anything that you've come across particularly that might be of interest.
I'm actually in the American room as a moment, so if you just bear with me.
Real time.
Real-time research, absolutely.
Sometimes surprising. We have a copy here of, let me just try and find the right volume. There was a survey done for a railway survey done in the 1850s, for obviously as groundwork for the transcontinental railway. Obviously that was postponed because of the Civil War, unfortunately. But one of the surprises that we had is that throughout this multi-volume work that we have here is actually quite a good record on the natural history and the geological history of the Southwest and the West as well. And it's kind of like, it was surprising because it's produced all these illustrations, all these fabulous illustrations of like birds, flora and fauna and everything. So it sounds, unfortunately, it's a bit amateur. I can't share the screen. I can just show you the picture. so things like, you know, it's a really good record, not only for obviously for railway history, but for you know, the history of scientific illustration, and obviously the natural and environmental history of the region as well, the mid-19th century.
Amazing. I think we have the Birds of America as in one of our original founding collections, Argula, isn't it? And that's incredible. So it is one of those amazing things once you start researching on your topic, how many different routes you can go down. But yeah, if anyone else has got anything to share. Claire's got another question, actually. Is there a particular place you would recommend for accessing primary resources regarding late 18th century cultural and social history?
Trying to think of some examples. Is it related to a particular country or continent, or are we specifically talking about?
Claire's talking about North America, also, but particularly place in terms of where to start in terms of our resources and particular strengths, if you like, in the collections.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of I'm assuming, yeah, exactly. In North America, of course, you say. Right, I'd say for the 18th century, if you're mainly looking for the electronic collections and not the print collections necessarily, actually, I don't think there's a really comprehensive resource for that. So what I really recommend is that you look across different resources. I think I mentioned a few individual resources in my slide that I presented on, and usually a lot of electronic resources are already grouped by different themes. So one of the things I mentioned was the one about immigration, and the other one about Native Americans, and the other one about women's experiences. So I think that's kind of where you can gather together the experiences of different groups and gather a bit of social and cultural history from there. So it's not necessarily that there's one resource. You have to do that approach of looking across different resources, really, in that case. But maybe someone else has a better idea of how to approach that.
I think you're right, Arga, and it's certainly in the kind of narrowing down of the field search. Indeed, the live search you did showed how many thousands of results come up. So it's about narrowing down that search and really focusing in on what you want to look at in that particular very broad search term, because otherwise, yes, that is rather a lot to go through. So
one thing you could do is to use secondary sources to find the primary sources. I think, you could go to BBIH if you have access, find a very specific few works, a range of works, and if they're all talking about the same sources, then you're onto a winner there, I think.
Good tip. And I just check for any more questions. Someone's asked, do students of UCL have access to Senate House Library? And if so, how do we find out how to log in?
Okay, I guess that's one for me. So what you can do is we currently have a remote registration service in place if you don't have a membership yet, which basically allows you to instantly sign up online for a Senate House Library membership. And with that, you can have access to the electronic content as well as our click and collect service, which will allow you to take out print books. I'm just posting the link in the chat to that, so you have access to that there. Basically, you just need to go down to UCL in the list, click on registration form and fill in your details from there. And that's how you get access to all our services.
Yes, that's great. And it's been a lot easier since lockdown, actually. That's spurred on that fully remote registration. So you should be able to do that in just a few clicks. I think that's all the questions we have at the moment.
I think there's a question, sorry, in
the actual chat.
Which is for Sarah.
Yes, so Tioni Paris has asked, I haven't managed to get a hold of Sarah Dunstan's book just yet, but I'm particularly interested in the research into the Pan-African Congress. Where specifically would one find the sources on these events?
That's a great question. I've actually written an article specifically about the 1919 Pan-African Congress, which should be available through library databases if that interests you. In terms of primary sources, a number are available in France only in sort of physical form, but in terms of material around it, there are two places I would recommend you look. One is the W.E.B. Du Bois digitized archives, which are available through Credo, and the other is through the Brown University has a project called the Modernist Journal Archive. And what they've done is they've digitized a whole series of journals, including some of the earlier out of copyright issues of the crisis. And there are a couple of articles in there by W.B. Du Bois, but also by the novelist and teacher Jessie Fawcett, who wrote about some of the later Pan-African congresses. So that would be a good place to start.
Fantastic.
Picking up on the Pan-Africanism, it's a term we recently introduced on BIH and back catalogues and some data, and this is the listing for Pan-Africanism. It's again British and colonial and imperial data, but it's a good starting point for secondary resources, so you can see where they've gone to find their information. And there's 57 entries, and I think there is a place in Manchester, and I think it came from, if I can find it, Black Baptist and Pan-Africanism in Britain, 1890 to 1913, the second item down on that list, if everyone can see it. I think there's a Manchester-based archive there. But if you trawl through that, you can see and read them. You can probably see where they got their information from. As you can see, it includes George Padmore, Sinclair Drake, C.L.R. James, as you can imagine, and W.B. Du Bois as well. So there's enough material there to go exploring and seeing what they were using. And just stop sharing that.
Great, thank you. We're now at 2:15, so unless there are any burning questions, I think we will bring the event to a close. But as we said before, we will send the presentations to you, the links to resources and the contact details for all our speakers here today. So if you do have any further questions, do feel free to get in touch. And as always, do feel free to get in touch with your academic librarians at any time to ask their amazing insight into the collections, and they can really help you narrow down your search and provide you with such wonderful information that they've provided today. So thank you everyone for attending, and we'll be in touch with the resources. Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
Thank you everyone, bye.